Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new series of The Negotiation Room. It is tremendous to be here with the first in our three-part series, and what is, I think, now season 5, perhaps, Keld, of The Negotiation Room. It's getting to feel a little bit like the Game of Thrones, but without perhaps quite the same level of violence. And so, of course, as always, delighted to be joined by co-host Keld Jensen, and today by a newcomer who doesn't actually really know what he's let himself in for, John Diefenbach. And John is a lead negotiator with law firm. I don't know why I'm calling her law firm, although of course you probably have some legal activities these days, but with EY, familiar name to all of us. And our topic today is whether or not there should be a chief negotiating officer. And Keld and I have had opinions on this for some time, and we decided it was time to bring it to our audience and to test out your thoughts as well on this key question. So do please join us in chat. Let us know what you think as we go through the program. But even now, as we start, I'd love to have your opinions. What's your starting point? Do you think it's time that your organization should appoint a chief negotiation officer? Keld, let me pass to you.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, I'm excited. I'm excited we have John here today. I was actually very happy when I found John, and I found John to be heading a negotiation elite division. And on top of that, I found John to be an excellent expert negotiator. So that just confirmed that, hey, there's something out there that we need to talk about. Just before we head in and having our dialogue, I just want to share a couple of slides with everybody. I hope you can see my screen right now. Because what I want to share with you guys is, hang on one second, is really what we see when we talk about negotiation. What is it that is really important? And one thing I want to talk with you and share with you right now is actually how we see it. And what I've been claiming for years, is that hundreds of thousands of negotiations are being wasted every single day. And what I actually mean by that is that the parties are meeting up and they don't reach an agreement. And I'm talking about negotiation where the two parties supposedly should have reached an agreement. So it would be the best outcome for both of them. And what we have found in our studies of more than 35,000 negotiations globally is that 1 out of 3 basically of all negotiations ends up in no deal, where it would have been more financially benefit. It would be a benefit, for both parties to reach a deal, but they don't. And there are many reasons for that. And one of them is actually the lack of competence in negotiation. They're not skilled, they're not educated, they don't have the background, they don't have the theory. The other reason that I call on some negotiation being wasteful is because they leave value on the table. And we actually know that up to 42% of the values in a negotiation is often left on the table. And people like John and his team are the one that comes and clean up, because they have the background, the knowledge, the experience, the education to know where to look for that value so they can actually capitalize the value. So I'm actually certain, we can hear from John in a second, I'm actually certain that an organization like EY is obviously not having John and his staff employed without it makes sense, without they create a profit, without them at least paying for their own wages, right? So look at it this way. I know none of us obviously are going and eat fast food ever, because we never eat fast food, but imagine that you actually did. So you went into a burger place and you order a burger and you're getting your burger, but it looks like this, right? So there's 42% of the burger missing. I'm sure you wouldn't be happy. You would go back up to the counter and say, this is first and foremost disgusting. And secondly, I'm missing 42% of the value. And imagine that in your negotiation, you're actually missing that value. And that's what an expert elite division could actually help you with, utilizing that. I'm just summing out now, and I'm just doing that with a couple of research studies, and there's plenty of them out there. I don't want to bore you with too many, but just a couple of them. And what we know is that my university, BMI Leuven University in Belgium, has actually identified that 60% of your business success is based on your knowledge in negotiation. World Economic Forum have published several times a study claiming that the skill of negotiation is on the top 10 most important skill, regardless what job you're in. McKenzie and Company have recently released a study as well, where they're talking about the future key citizen skills. So what is the future citizen of the world, what is it they are supposed to do and are able to do, and negotiation is very high on that list as well. And last but not least, there's a German consultancy organization named Dimens, who have actually said that if you are in procurement, negotiation is the third most important skill you've got. The last thing I want to share with you guys is actually the intro for what we're talking about today. That is back to McKinsey and Company, because very recently they did a study where they interviewed Fortune 500 CEOs in the US. And as you can see, 93% of those CEOs are actually saying that they have a great interest in introducing the chief negotiation officer within 3 years. And on top of that, 96% of those who said they want to introduce the chief negotiation officer, they actually believe that it will raise the earning by at least 5%. So I find all of this to be very exciting, because obviously there's a huge potential. And when I work with clients and students around the world, I often find that a lot of people are actually not at the level where they should be, because some people are doing what they've always done, and that means they haven't really focused on developing their negotiation skills. So, John, what's your opinion of all of this? Are you believing there's a future for the chief negotiation officer?
Absolutely, Keld. And I think it's a vital addition for top performing companies to get a chief negotiation officer, to get somebody who is a touchstone of best practices for all the reasons that you mentioned. It certainly does have an impact to the bottom line. And I think what you're seeing in these studies, the reactions from the CEOs, it reminds me very much of logistics back in the 90s. All of a sudden, companies discovered the importance of logistics and the impact it had to the bottom line. And the software industry took off with new logistics software, warehouse management, transportation management software, et cetera. And we've seen how that has played out in creating new and competitive businesses with Amazon and Walmart, how critical it is to be able to move goods in and out. Negotiation, top performing companies are always looking for what is that new corner of the company where I can improve behaviors and processes and generate greater profits. And negotiation is that untapped area in companies where everybody says they want to do it better, but it's like we all want to be in better shape. But when do we actually wake up at 5:30 in the morning and do our workout and eat better and stay away from fast food, as you said, to get ourselves in shape? So the desire is certainly there. I think what's missing is sharing widely the quantification of the value and convincing CEOs and getting them to get that first step of saying, let's look into this and let's do something here, because it will pay for itself 10 times over once you start to establish that expertise.
Right. Tim,
well,
what's your experience?
Well, all very compelling stuff, Keld and John, but if 93% of CEOs are so convinced that this is such a critical role and position, why is it that we can't actually find any chief negotiation officers already in existence? I mean, it does raise, I think, some pretty clear questions. And maybe one of the points is because there isn't really a strong, compelling argument. I think as I look at my own rather too long history in the world of business and negotiation, there have been many times I've seen something similar to this proposed, and certainly there have been periods, certainly I remember back in my time in IBM when it first went into the outsourcing world, that of course that was a highly specialist, complex activity, particularly for a business that had traditionally been selling computers. So yes, was there a need to build new negotiation skill? Absolutely. And a consequence of that was that a specialist team was assembled that used to fly around the world doing outsourcing negotiations. But that was because there was so little competence in the business. So it needed to be seeded, it needed to be developed. And the key to me is the point that if negotiation is so critical, and I would personally endorse and agree that it is, it does need to be built as an organizational competence, not reside simply in a limited number of specialists.
Right. Well, you know what, Tim, I completely agree with you on what you just said. However, what I have found is if we're trying to build it as a competence in the organization, that task is both too big and too expensive. I actually met a client recently who said, I had a great 2 days negotiation course 18 years ago. It was very good. And I was thinking, oh my God, you know, so you did training 18 years ago. And I've been asking, have you read any books on negotiation since then? He said, no, I haven't. And I said, have you joined anything else that could teach you negotiation? And he said, no, I haven't. And he was actually negotiating for millions of dollars every single day. And I think that's one of the problems we have, that people are really what I call unconsciously incompetent. And I'm not criticizing people. I mean, they're bright, they're intelligent, but they're focused on something else. They might be an engineer or a legal expert or CPA or whatever. So they have the expert field that they need to focus on. And then adapting a new field like negotiation, which is really a science on its own, require a completely different skill set. So yes, Tim, you could actually argue that you should invest in developing and educating all these people, and you could, but that assignment is enormous. The alternative is having somebody like John and his team. So when you have a really important negotiation, you call them and said, hey, John, we're in trouble. Come and help us. What's your opinion, John?
Yeah, it's funny you tell that story, because a lot of times I see negotiation training and developing negotiation skills for a lot of executives is like getting an inoculation. You'll say to them, okay, we're going into a negotiation. Oh, you're a negotiator? I took a negotiation class 18 years ago. I've had my shot, so I must be a good negotiator at this point. And people don't appreciate, organizations don't appreciate that there is a discipline. This is a change management exercise to get people to behave not only differently, but consistently with whatever the philosophy, the negotiation philosophy of the organization is. So it's not enough to train. Then you also have to continue to follow up. To your point, Keld, have you read any books? Thought leadership on it. Keep the drip going for people so that they understand it. Tell stories about where things were successful. I have a wonderful story from years ago where we had a bid with a client. Client came back and asked for a huge price discount on the deal. And it was a high-risk situation with a large energy company over in Europe. And we said, no, we cannot reduce the price anymore because this is too risky. We need to make sure that we have all the resources that we can to get this deal done. We cannot take any resources out of this. The client came back to us and said, you won the deal. They said, that was a test, because you kept telling us how important it was to have this team. If you had cut your price, you would have destroyed trust with us, because we would have realized that none of what you were saying was true. That story has become so powerful for people to hear, that the commitments that we make to clients, sometimes when they come back and say, I want you to give me a little more, they're actually kind of pinging you to see, are you really telling me the truth? Is this really your best price? Is this really the team that you need, or are you playing games? And so that kind of storytelling needs to continue to go through the organization in order to get the changed behavior and changed thinking that you need for better and more productive negotiations.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. We actually got a great comment, John, from Anu. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. And Anu is saying, maybe we first define the role purpose of a chief negotiation officer. I think that's an excellent comment. What is a chief negotiation officer, John?
A chief negotiation officer would be somebody who is the touchstone and kind of the architect for how are we going to behave as an organization? What is our mantra going to be? What's the focus going to be here? And generate that sense among people that collaboration in negotiation is possible. I think there are a lot of people who get that inoculation of negotiation training, but they're still afraid of going into the room and facing somebody who's more confrontational, somebody who's positional, and they don't know how to calm down the room. They don't know how to, I always use the phrase, run the room, in terms of getting everybody to think collaboratively, work collaboratively, and produce the most value from the deal. So the chief negotiation officer is the person who can explain the importance of process in negotiation and how a disciplined and collaborative process is necessary to produce a better outcome versus, because you see the behavior all the time, right? Somebody says, the client sent the contract over to us, let's redline it and send it back. And then they redline it and they send it back over, and it goes back and forth, and nobody talks to anybody. And I always
Right.
tell people, when you get a draft, your next action is to pick up the phone and talk about the draft, not to respond to the draft, because you can get very confused about what people have written on a piece of paper. So you need better communication. And that's where a chief negotiation officer can set up a process that says, this is how we work with our clients. This is how we communicate, how we sell, how we negotiate, how we close, and how we negotiate after we close, because deals often expand after they're signed. So who's going to be doing that work after the fact in managing change orders and negotiating expansion of scope?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is all very fine, and it's great conversation points, and we all know that organizations need to become better at doing negotiation. But of course, they need to get better at a lot of things too, and unfortunately, too many of those attributes that really should be endemic and part of a company's DNA. If we're not careful, we create these chiefs of everything as an excuse for not actually doing the stuff we need to do. I mean, what about having a chief problem-solving officer? Or we know that the biggest source of value erosion out of contracts is actually statements of work. Oh, let's have a chief SOW officer. We could go on just appointing and appointing and appointing.
Yeah,
I think that's real old school thinking. We're talking more and more today about developing platforms, operational structures that actually are now silos to be broken down. Why do we want to create yet another silo? I think, Rod is with me on this one. Well, I hope he is. I'm going to take his words in vain. He's saying, why on earth do I need a chief negotiation or another chief? People who are really good at this stuff get promoted into positions where they use their negotiation skills as part of their business remit. We just don't need more specialists in a world where actually, and you know this, Keld, specialism is often a problem. I mean, look at all those chief risk officers we've got who are preventing business from happening.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of value in what you're saying, Tim, in terms of the danger of specialization and so on. But something that you mentioned about standardization of statements of work and contracts and so forth, because every company creates their form and says, this is our standard contract, here's how we're going to work. But every company does not create a process that says, and this is how we're going to negotiate. And one of the things, and you mentioned IBM, I started my career doing outsourcing deals at IBM back in the early 90s. So I was part of that specialist team that was actually doing those deals. And over my career, I've been with several other companies, and what I've found is their negotiation philosophy really becomes cats and dogs, because it's based on what do all of the people who've come from other organizations do. I mean, EY is the same thing. We have a lot of people who come in from other places. When I was in other companies, you were always hiring lateral people, and they had different trainings, different backgrounds, or maybe they had been taught this is the way you do it at this company. And so there's a need to take all of those different views and strategies and kind of get them into at least a standardization to say, this is the process that we have to follow, because we don't want people doing this willy-nilly. I joked with Keld one time that I had somebody come up to me and hand me a PowerPoint deck and say, could you review the contract, please? This is what we're going to send over to the client to sign. I said, what are you talking about? This is a PowerPoint deck. You don't have people sign PowerPoint decks. Where did this person learn how to do deals that they think that this is the end process? So, there's some people who are on the way far end of the spectrum in terms of not understanding how this gets done. So there needs to be at least some foundational stuff that we establish.
Right.
Well,
right.
now,
I would actually agree with Rod as well, because what Rod is saying is, if I read that correctly, is why do we need a chief negotiation officer? And he's saying those of us who are already the corporate lead negotiator recognized as that in the corporation. Well, that's true. I mean, I'm not focused on the title should be there. I'm just focused on the knowledge should be there. Just like we have an IT department or legal department. Why would we have that then? Then we would educate anybody in the organizations to handle their own computer issues, right? And it's the same thing with negotiators. So we can always argue if there should be a CNO. It's not really important to me, but I think it's very important that we have a negotiation lead. We have somebody who's specialized in that science.
Yeah.
Well, so I think we can all agree that it is an important competence that needs to operate at varying levels across the business. I mean, you know, to your point about templates and contract standards, of course, John, very often we put, as we've talked about in previous programs, we put forward a whole series of non-negotiators. I mean, IBM used to be really good at that. It was called objection handling. It was all about how do you avoid negotiation. And of course, their whole approach then was, oh, well, we can't negotiate with you because of fairness to other customers. So we come up with all sorts of contortions to prevent negotiation, and partly that's also because we recognize that a lot of people are probably not innately particularly good negotiators, and giving them negotiation authority is very risky. But that does take it to your point. I absolutely agree. We do need to have process. We do need to have sensible standards. Our research has consistently shown that very few organizations even have a standardized approach to negotiation planning. You know, I mean, that seems to be such a fundamental thing that's missing. And that's where I get back, as I said, to this concern that if we're not careful, we create these specialist groups that we know what happens when you create a specialist group. They set themselves apart. They create justification for their own existence. You get into all these internal power battles over who's got authority to do what. We don't need that stuff. We do definitely need, you're right in saying. Now, what about the role then of a chief learning officer, to the extent we have them, or those responsible for training and learning? Should we not be looking much more at expanding and extending and redefining their roles to make sure that they are actually responsible and accountable for building key competencies in the business, which would include, obviously, something like negotiation?
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Sorry, John, go ahead. No, it's fine.
I was going to say, I think that's a great point. The chief learning officer is a critical role for all of the things that the company needs to evolve and to make sure that people are being well trained. You know, it's the joke about, I think, I can't remember which CEO the quote was from, where somebody said, what if I train my people and they leave? And the answer was, what if you don't train your people and they stay? So you want to get your people trained up. You want to have a focus in terms of how are we going to bring them up. The issue I have with negotiation falling under the chief learning officer is it feels like, you know, this is another nice to have. This is how you sort of get to expand your knowledge base, whereas I think, as Keld, as you said, this is seen as a critical skill for people to have. And I would say that for the folks who are on this call, there are a number of professional negotiators on this call who are in procurement. Procurement people are where the professional negotiators live in an organization. And I'm on the other side. I'm on the sales side. And what many organizations end up doing is sending a salesperson or somebody in to, quote, negotiate with procurement. And you're sending somebody in who is underskilled to deal with somebody who takes negotiation training and negotiation itself very, very seriously. So if we are not training people up who are going to have that first point of contact with the folks who are the buyers, the sourcing people, the procurement people, that's where a lot of companies are missing an opportunity to be able to send somebody in who is collaborative, who understands the process, and also is comfortable talking in what sometimes can be, you know, an awkward and positional conversation and trying to win over the other party to say, here's why I think we could do this deal better. You know, let's talk about some other options, et cetera. So that's it. There are professional negotiators. They're just from my perspective, they're all on the other side of the table right now. And we have to have more professional people on my side of the table in order to generate better outcomes for companies who are selling services and products.
Sure, absolutely. I just want to share a very a small piece of research we did once. And what we actually discovered, this is kind of interesting talking about competence. We discovered that talking about professional negotiator, what is a professional negotiator? Well, in my world, everybody who get a part of their paycheck to negotiate on behalf of their organization is, in my definition, professional, right? So when we look at all professional negotiators, we actually discovered that 20%, 1 out of 5 was actually incompetent in the science of negotiation. They were not good at it. They shouldn't do it. They shouldn't be heading a negotiation. And we were very curious to figure out why. And what we actually discovered was very, very simple. It was not because of a skill set or lack of intelligence, anything else. No, it was way more simple than that. Those who wasn't qualified and couldn't get qualified, it didn't matter how much training you put on them, was because they didn't like negotiation, John, right? Mm-hmm. I think we can all agree as human beings that we get better at something we truly enjoy. And I honestly meet a lot of people who doesn't like negotiation. Yes. I think I've said it before on this show, Tim, that some people hide behind redlining the contract. They hide behind the screen. They hide behind the spreadsheet. And I'm a bit rude when I'm saying that. I don't want to offend anybody, but quite often I find people do that because they are scared of picking up the phone or meeting the counterpart, because that's a negotiation that could be confrontational, where the counterpart says no, and we don't like that. So there's some group of people, and they could be great CPAs or legal advisors or engineers or whatever, but they just don't like to negotiate. So it's really sad that they're being forced out there to negotiate, because they're losing fortunes every single day.
Yeah, that's right. And if people are not they don't feel comfortable, competent at doing it, then they shouldn't be in that role, frankly. They shouldn't be in a position where they have to do something that, and some people just never will get comfortable. There is a muscle memory that one can develop over time. There is the ability to practice. And in fact, when somebody comes to me and says, I've got a really difficult negotiation with my client, the project we're working on, we've had some problems, so we have to tell them that we're not going to meet the deadlines. What do I do? It's okay, well, here's how you should have it, but let's practice that conversation, because what they're worried about more than anything is the emotion that will be generated in the room, and how is it going to feel to have this conversation. It's them for the first time going down the roller coaster. You don't know what to expect. You don't know where the hills and the turns are, so you're nervous about it. So I always encourage people to do a role play before a big negotiation or a big conversation about an issue. Do a role play. And when I do it, I am the worst, meanest, loudest client anybody has ever encountered. I open with insults, I yell, because I generate real emotion from the other party, where now they still have to respond to me, but they're in the middle of this emotional firestorm. And when we're done, their response is, well, the next negotiation is going to be easy compared to what you just did to me. And it's, yes, exactly, because you're worried about the emotion. I just put you on the worst roller coaster you could be on. Now this one looks like a kiddie coaster by comparison. Now you're ready for it. Some people never will get comfortable with it, but some people embrace it when you give them that opportunity to practice.
Okay, so what we really need is a chief difficult conversation officer. Now, let's just reflect for a moment, because, of course, big organizations undertake a myriad of different negotiation types. And, it's always a tough balance, isn't it? Deciding just how embedded do we make the skill? How much do we invest in building it, maintaining it? As we look across the spectrum, what are the gains and losses? Keld, I'm sure you're right. Maybe there is 42% of lost value. But on the other hand, many CEOs might look at that and say, yeah, but there are many times when I'm actually prepared to sacrifice a bit of value for speed, because actually speed matters to me. Meeting this quarter end result matters to me. Our stock price matters to me. So, all very fine, Keld, you telling me about all these wonderful things I should be doing, but I've actually got a whole series of competing measurements. A measurement does, of course, lie at the heart of so much of this. Why is it that salespeople, some of them, of course, are personally excellent negotiators, but often their position is compromised because it's all about speed, bringing in revenue as quickly as possible, meeting my personal target so I get my commissions. I mean, we know full well why many salespeople are not good negotiators in the classic book of negotiation. But from a point of view of the corporation's goals and objectives, they're often doing exactly what the company wants them to do.
Yeah.
Procurement people, those who are strongly driven by negotiated savings, do they actually achieve optimum value? Frequently not. I can buy lots of things very cheap. Whether or not they really are the best business solution is often open to some real question. So I think as we look at this, we have to recognize that organizations are balancing a whole series of different factors here, where the nature of the negotiation skill, the nature of the approach they want to take, the whole philosophy of negotiation is going to be different depending upon the category that you're buying, the duration of the agreement, the extent of uncertainty that's implicit within it. This is where we really have to build, surely, a much greater sophistication in our businesses to understand the segmentation almost of negotiation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Tim, that there often are conflicting interests here. I always joke that salespeople want the shortest path to signature. They come to me and say, hey, can you help me with this deal? We talk about it and I say, yeah, it's probably going to take us about 60 days to get through all of this. And they say, I don't have 60 days. How do we get this done in 30 days? Very badly. That's how we get it done in 30 days. I don't care. I've got to get it done in 30 days. And it goes to the old business mantra that you get what you measure. And so companies that are focused on revenue are going to get behaviors from their people that drive revenue. Right. Companies that are focused on profitability, they're going to have to change those behaviors because optimizing profitability is not a fast process. It's something that takes some rigor and often a lot of influence in selling for the client in order to really demonstrate the value of what it is that the client's going to bring. I think Apple would sell a lot of more iPhones a lot faster at $300 a pop. They'd be flying off the shelves, but they know the value of the iPhone, so they sell them for $1,000 a piece, and they have to keep marketing, telling people these are great and they're better than everybody else's, but they're taking the time because the margins are worth it for them in the end. So they're not trying to sell stuff fast and cheap. They want it to be good, value-based, high margin. That's what they're measuring, and that's what they get.
But of course, Apple is an interesting example. It goes back to the IBM of 40 years ago of we don't negotiate.
Yeah.
They don't feel a need to negotiate. They don't create relationships which need negotiation. Right. So that's a very deliberate strategy, at least based on the conversations I've had with Apple. Probably not a massive client of yours, Keld. But let me, if I may, you raised an important point there, John, about the nature of what we are negotiating for. Is it revenue? Is it profit? Can we go in for a moment? What are your thoughts about the shift of corporate value as we begin to see ESG intruding as a component of value measurement, as we begin to see, obviously, reputational risk increasingly impinging on how we go about doing things? Are you observing that in negotiations? And what do you think that does to the measurements, the skill set required for negotiators?
The focus on ESG and all of the other different social topics that have come up, social elements that have come into business like that, is very powerful for a negotiator, because at the end of the day, a client makes a decision on which vendor to go with on the basis of trust. Who do I believe is going to best be suited to deliver the outcome that I'm looking for? The more that a company is able to stand up and say, this is the type of corporate citizen I am in the business world, the greater the sort of halo effect on them is, in terms of an organization that thinks about the right things and is trying to do the right things and generating greater trust. Because that's what I'm always trying to build in the room. I'm trying to build trust with the other party in the room, that I'm trying to get the best outcome for both of us. And so the more that companies are focused on that broader spectrum of issues, global issues, in terms of who are we as a corporate citizen in the world, I believe they generate a lot more trust with their clients, and it makes deal making easier for me.
We had, and I'm sorry, I'm sort of taking off a slightly different path here, but I think it is a really interesting one, because we actually pulled together a working group and had a first meeting yesterday talking about contracting for ESG. And of course, something you'll be well aware people are struggling with. There are no standards, yet it's an area that dramatically calls out for standards. There's so little transparency across supply chains, supply networks. How do you collect the data? The data isn't consistently reported. How much meaning is there to the data, et cetera, et cetera. One of the interesting things that came out yesterday, a mix of big corporates, a mix of procurement and sales contracting professionals, and a lot of emphasis on the point that actually as you go down these more social issues, it isn't something you can do to somebody. That both parties really have to come to that party together. So are you beginning to observe this greater spirit of we are in this together? I mean, clearly we saw that at the beginning of the pandemic. Then it seemed to collapse somewhat. Our latest, most negotiated term studies suggest that we've not made any real progress at all. But what are you observing? What do you see as that need for the negotiator of the future? In your role as a chief negotiation officer, of course.
That's a question for me or for Keld?
Well, for you, actually. Yeah,
for
I
me.
mean, just from a practical point of view, so
yes.
You are now that chief negotiation officer. What are you going to do, John?
Yeah, no, I think, and it's one of the reasons I'm very proud to work for EY is ESG and social responsibility is a big part of who we are. It is something where you've got to be in it together, and it's not something that can be transactional. The notion of how we're going to evolve with certain ESG initiatives has to be something that the two parties are both aligned to at an almost DNA level in order to really be successful in what they're trying to produce as an outcome from the negotiation. It can't just be one side trying to, quote, force something on the other party. So I am an advocate for it, as is EY, and I do think it is part of the negotiation of the future that we have to be adept and understand what the issues are in there, and getting a sense from the other party about how comfortable are they talking about these issues, and are they willing to embrace them, and are they willing to go forward, and that's going to take time. Let's be honest, it's going to take time because it's a big transformation culturally and corporately for a lot of people.
What are you seeing in that regard, Keld?
Well, I completely agree with John. I think that it's certainly a rising topic. It's something that I'm involved in already. I see more and more organizations that actually come to us and say, how can we negotiate ESG? Because one of the things I'm keen to do is try and capitalize variables and put a value and a cost on them. And suddenly people get desperate because that's really hard when we're talking ESG in many cases. And how do you report on that? So that is definitely a rising topic that is certainly of great interest. I just want to add two things, though, and just stepping back, because what John was saying, that we do what we're measured in, and back to arguing in favor again of having a specialist division in an organization. I had a client a couple of years ago. I was participating as an advisor, and I was sitting watching my client negotiating different variables, and everything was fine with the exception of terms of payment. I could see he could have improved that quite a lot. And he was a bright guy. So after we were done out of the parking lot, I went to my client and said, why didn't you improve terms of payment? That would have been way better for the company. And then he looked at me and said, personally, I don't get any benefit out of that. That is Steve O in finance, and I hate that idiot. So that just explains to you again that you need a corporate, sometimes head of negotiation that actually takes account of and are responsible for the best of interest of the company, because procurement are often negotiating on behalf of procurement, sales are negotiating on behalf of sales, project are negotiating on behalf of a project, then as John is pointing out, we do what we're measured on, right? So if you are measured on just getting this thing, that's what you negotiate. But that's certainly in lots of cases not the best for the organization. The other comment, Tim, and this is a bit unfair because I haven't prepared Tim for that. I was speaking at the VIDE Summit, and I actually did a poll among the audience I was talking to whether they felt there was a need for a specialist function like CNO, and 71% of my audience said yes, Tim. I don't know whether I manipulated them before the answer, but that was a huge support of that as well.
No, well, actually, I've always asked our audiences to be kind to you. So,
sorry, we have a great comment from Diane, and this is a question for you, John, really, because Diane is saying a negotiation is a very relational process, and I agree with that. And it requires that you have a good connection and you create trust, as you're pointing out. So, John, the question really is, how do you step into a negotiation on behalf of one of your internal clients? Because I guess, you can't create that relationship that they may have with your clients. So how do you cope with that? Are you the one that is heading the negotiation on behalf of EY? Or are you sitting there as a supporter for your internal client, the CPA?
No, we are the lead negotiators. If you think about the days when you used to have conference rooms and people would all, sit down in the conference room and start, we are center of the table, first chair. And as I said, I use the phrase run the room, which is why I have a blog, Running the Room, which is the difference between people who are occasional negotiators and people who are discipline focused negotiators is most people negotiate on a linear basis. They go issue, 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 signature. The way that we approach it is we are holistic negotiators. When I walk into the room, the first thing I'm thinking about is who's on the other side of the table. So to exactly Diane's point, how am I going to build a relationship with the other party and build what I call transactional trust? I have to find little things that I can do to give them a sense of I'm okay to work with. And that comes from the moment I walk in the room. How do I say hello? How am I dressed? What's their first impression of me? Do I look threatening or do I look like somebody I can work with? So there's a whole psychological process that one has to go through of influence to sort of win over the hearts and minds of the folks on the other side of the table to say, and this is a study, the Harvard study that showed the two things that people look at first are competence and warmth. Is this somebody who can do the deal? And is this somebody who I want to work with? And so you have to come in those first few minutes of meeting the client with the right balance of competence and warmth to show them we can get this done together. And very often that's the approach I'll take. When I find out who's leading the negotiation from the client side, I will look for an opportunity to take them aside and say, look, you and I are the deal makers in the room. We've been doing this for a long time. We know what it's going to. Let's you and I try to manage everybody else and all the emotion and timetables and everything else. We'll get this done together. And I'm trying to build that affiliation immediately that we've got a project to do. We're going to be the problem solvers. We will get the deal done at working as a kind of a team almost. So Diane's point is exactly right. There's a tremendous amount of emotion that's at stake when you first get started. And the question is, do you have a strategy about how to deal with that emotion and put yourself in a position where you can best influence the other party to get to where you think is the best outcome for both parties?
Right. Yeah.
Yes, certainly that point of identifying an alter ego is key, and again, it of course applies in the bigger deals. I mean, it applies to a degree across the board, but of course, when you're talking a large deal that is going to have significant impact on business performance, business results, then the higher it goes, the more important that sense of affinity really is.
Yes.
I do want to pick up, I mean, there is no question that a good negotiator is somebody who aligns stakeholders, who, has that ability to persuade, to problem solve, and to influence. So those are all really important skills. And operating in that sense as a cross-functional integrator is absolutely fundamental. But, and here we come back to the point, I don't need a chief negotiation officer to do that, because actually, if I've really thought through my commercial function, then that's the job of my chief commercial officer or my head of commercial. Commercial management is an integrationist role. Now, unfortunately, of course, we've historically had a bit of a problem, particularly with the United States, because they haven't really recognized the discipline of commercial management in the same way as it's often been recognized in Europe. So, you know, the US took division of labor really seriously. I mean, they took John Smith far more seriously than people in the UK did. Adam Smith, sorry, not John. John was his brother. So, you know, we have, in a sense, a particular problem with countries that have followed that procedural lead. And of course, unfortunately, that then got reflected in the business systems we put in place, you know, ERP systems, which are once again reflective of those functional silos, that division of labor, which was about driving low-cost production, but doesn't serve us well in a world of growing complexity, where we're trying to package solutions, where we're offering long-term services. That's anathema to that rigid structure. So do I agree that we need a new and different mechanism to bring integration to the business? And it's going to take some time. This journey towards a more integrated platform-based business, which everybody recognizes we're onto, digitalization is taking us down exactly that route. So over time, it may be that we don't need those cross-functional integrators and coordinators. But for the period we do, then we really need a senior commercial group that is in fact providing that business integration and offering that interface of confidence with our counterparties.
All right. And your point is a very valid one, Tim, with regard to the post-contract contract management work, because some of the better organizations that I have worked with have established contract management groups because they recognize how much can be lost after the deal is signed if we don't manage the relationship properly. And these are often people who are not very high-level people that are doing the day-to-day interfaces with the client and taking the request that, can you do more? Can you fix this? Can you fix that? And they have to say yes, and here's what the charge is going to be, not yes, and we will do that for free for the relationship. That's when the money all goes out the door. So those people tend to think, oh, negotiation training, we've got to train all our executives. Yeah, you have to train the executives, but that's so they understand the philosophy and the lexicon and the behavior of why the people who are lower down are doing what they're doing, why they're saying no to things instead of yes, and they're not getting overruled by people who are higher up because they say this is the right strategy. Does that have to be a chief negotiation officer necessarily? I think it's an ideal way to do it because it puts a spotlight on somebody to say this is where the source of expertise is. But to your point, whatever your target operating model is, if it is in part of the commercial organization, part of the sales organization, do you have a senior VP of sales who says, all of my sales guys need to be trained in negotiation and this is our selling process? Then that's terrific as well. The problem is a lot of people who end up in these roles, their leadership does not do a good job demonstrating to the corporation, and I think you made this point earlier about the value, right? We make sure that our leadership understands the value that we are driving, the comparison between here's where you could have been and here's where you got as a result of being more disciplined in your approach. And basically saying, not only do we pay for ourselves, we pay for your ROI on us is 12 times because of what we're bringing in. And I don't think organizations, when they set up these groups, they know that they need to keep selling their purpose and their existence upward in order to survive and to grow. That's just not inherent in the role.
I want to add one thing, John, and that is it's very rare to find a big corporation that wouldn't have a communication strategy, right? So they have instructed all the departments how they should communicate to the market, the suppliers, the clients, and everybody. But when I ask major corporation if I could see their negotiation strategy, very often the executive level are quiet for a long time, and then some of them says, because they don't have one. So the interesting thing for me, John, is they allowed everybody to run around and do their own negotiation, left and right, and north and south, and nobody knows who, whatever they're doing. Somebody's collaborative and somebody's is very positional and combative, and it's a mess. And to me, in this day and age, 2022, it writes me like a nightmare that organizations have no control on how their organization negotiate, but they're very focused on how they communicate, or how their research and development are working, or how they go to market, or all the other strategies are there. But when I ask them about negotiation strategy, they are all quiet. So this is something, again, whether we call it chief negotiation officer or something else, there needs to be somebody that is in charge of implementing a strategy on negotiation as well, and make sure the organization is following that.
Right. Well, there are two elements of if you go back to the 7 elements of a negotiation of getting to yes, Fisher and Urey. The 2 elements to look for to start any engagement is relationship and BATNA. And if you say BATNA to somebody and they look at you with a blank stare, then you've got a problem. They really don't understand fundamentals of negotiation. But if a team comes to me and says, hey, we want to get involved in this deal, the first thing I will do is say, let's talk about the relationship with the client. Why do you think you can win this deal? What's our differentiator? And if they say, well, the client doesn't really know us, or the client's kind of mad at us because we messed something up. Okay, your relationship is red. Tell me about the competition. Oh, the client has any number of other vendors that they could go to who could do this equally well. Well, now your BATNA is red. If your relationship is red and your BATNA is red, why would you pursue the deal? Because the client doesn't like us and the client can go somewhere else. So those are 2 very fundamental questions to ask that are based on negotiation principles that many organizations don't ask as a step of qualifying the deal. Just the BATNA question alone, can we win, is a question that might disqualify you from chasing it and go spend the money somewhere else.
Well, I think the good news is, as we discovered, of course, in series 2, I think it was, of our programs, Keld, we know that machines are actually better negotiators than people. So the good news is that we increasingly program those machines with intelligence, and the point you're making are excellent, John. They're precisely the sort of thing, of course, we need to start putting into machines, where account teams are being asked those questions, where they're having to go through a qualification process in terms of, should we even be engaging here? And there is a lot more intelligence we can impart, and we are going to depend completely on people like you with your years of experience and wisdom to make sure that those machines get correctly programmed. So I think there's a critical role for you as the Chief Negotiation Development Planner within the CIO function.
That's a nice long title. I like that on a business card.
Yeah.
Well,
what is it?
I think to sum up, we clearly are at one in the fact that negotiation matters. I think we're at one in the fact that the degree and nature of negotiation does have high variability in a business, and there needs to be some overarching definition and support to the business to understand the nature of the form that negotiation should take. I completely agree with your point, Keld. There needs to be some strategic plan around it. And of course, that always means that somebody needs to be made accountable for its development, its implementation, and its oversight and maintenance. Whether or not that is a chief negotiation officer, or whether it is somebody else who perhaps has a significant cross-business integrationist role, well, we could probably debate that forever, and in the end, it probably doesn't really matter. What I hope we've managed to achieve today is that we've provoked some thoughts on everybody's part about actually how could your organization get better at improving its negotiated results? Does it need to have this sort of strategic conversation and really give thought to the level, depths, and structure for negotiation? Do you need a formalized negotiation strategy, do you at least need to start with a more structured approach to negotiation planning? And do you need to start thinking about tools and systems that can both constrain valueless negotiation, but also enable and empower better negotiation where it's desirable? Keld, John, let me leave the last word with both of you. You've got 2 minutes for your summing up.
John, go ahead.
Well, I think economically, the evidence is clear that having a disciplined negotiation process has tremendous financial returns for companies. And so dealing with the proposition, I believe a chief negotiation officer is in order for companies to create that focus, that discipline, that expertise that they're then able to flow down through their organization.
I just want to add, I've spent more than 20 years, 24 years actually to be exact, and trying to raise the awareness of the importance of negotiation. So I'm actually just happy that we now see that CEOs are actually recognizing this topic as something that should be taken up and discussed, and perhaps implementing a chief negotiation officer or not. But I'm just thrilled to see that it's actually the C-suite level are now talking about it. So I am very happy with that, Tim.
Yeah.
Both of you, thank you so much, and to our audience too, for your comments, participation, and I hope you'll join us for series number 2 in this series, when we'll be talking about whether or not curiosity killed the cat. We will be looking at what I think is another fascinating question of what is the role of curiosity in negotiation. To be a good negotiator, do you need to be curious, or does that just mean you are out of a job because it takes you too long to get any decisions made? We'll be exploring that with an expert, another expert on our program. Is it next week or in 2 weeks, Keld? I think it must be next week. Next week. Good. John, thank you so much for...
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Keld, for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Exposing yourself to this program.
Thanks, John.
Thank you so much. Okay. All right. Bye-bye now.
Goodbye.